Hey everybody, it's Overkill here with another Warhammer faction focused video. So today, keeping with the New World theme of the Lizardmen from last episode, we're going to be talking about the Dark Elves, the other faction to occupy the New World. So yeah, before we get into this episode, I would like to make the point that I am not a lore master, guys. I am definitely not someone that knows everything about Warhammer, every single last thing. I have a general knowledge of all the armies. I know what they do, what kind of units they have, but I don't know every single last thing about every single character. I don't know everything about every single faction. I'm just someone who is passionate about Warhammer and wants to make these videos to give information to the general public that may not know anything about Warhammer. So I very much appreciate your comments, the people who are lore adept, is that the word? The people who know their lore and stuff, who comment and say and correct my mistakes, very appreciated. I love that. So guys, if you're watching this, be sure to check the comments, because no doubt there will be I will have mistakes in these videos, but I try my best to read everything that I can and get everything right. But of course, some things will be wrong, as I can't just draw from the back of my mind every single thing about Warhammer. So I hope that doesn't bother you guys too much. But again, if you're new, check the comments, because no doubt there will be some things fixed down there. So let's get on to it. But thank you guys for commenting. Good and, well, not bad, but criticism and fixing my mistakes and such. It's all appreciated. Thank you all so much. And I'm sure there will be comments for this one as well, but I'll try my best. So the characteristics of the Dark Elves are, they are a very aggressive army. They're very fast. They're very flexible in terms of units. They have a core of solid warriors backed by fast flanking troops, armored elites, devastating ranged units, and lots of magic and good monsters. Apparently I didn't mention that in my notes. They are one of the fastest armies due to being elves, the fastest being the wood elves on the tabletop. They rely on their warriors to hold enemy units, while faster and more deadly forces flank around, and they also rely on ranged units to whittle down enemy elite units and then finish them off with monsters, cavalry, and infantry. They have access to a lot of very powerful magic, and they live in the land of Naggaroth after a failed civil war after the attempt of Malekith, the Witch King, to become Phoenix King of Ulthuan, former home of all elves, now refuge to the High Elves. So we'll get into the geography of Naggaroth. It is the westerly home of the Dark Elves, who have colonized it since they were exiled from their homeland in Ulthuan, and is located in the continent known as the New World. Naggaroth is bordered on the north by the Realm of Chaos, also called the Chaos Wastes, and on the south by the tip of Lustria. The continent is split by a vast and rugged mountain range called the Black Spines. The high average elevation and climate factors combined to make the average temperature across most of the continent bitterly cold. Thus, Naggaroth has been called the Land of Chill. Most of the continent is harsh and unforgiving wilderness, making travel over land extremely difficult. The Dark Elves have overcome this problem by exploring and charting a vast labyrinth of underground waterways which connect a series of fortified gates across the land. There are 6 major cities in Naggaroth, which contain a significant portion of the Dark Elf population. These cities were built as multi-walled fortresses, and almost all life in Naggaroth is centered around them. They are Naggaron, the Tower of Cold, the Dark Elf capital and seat of the Witch King; Grond, the North Tower where the sorceresses study the Realm of Chaos; Karankar, the Tower of Despair, largest slave port of the Dark Elves; Haggraif, the Dark Crag which is never touched by the sun's rays; Harganeth, the city of executioners and religious capital of the Cult of Cain; and Clar Caron, the Tower of Doom and largest Dark Elf shipyard. So we move on to politics and the society aspect of the Dark Elves. The society of Naggaroth is a hierarchical one, with the Witch King, Malekith, at the top. It has been argued, however, that the Dark Elves are in truth a Machiavellian society, with one man at the top and several powerful underlings in competition with each other, all vying for power, but simultaneously preventing others from getting it. Malekith allows this to continue because it keeps all sects strong and culling the weak, but also keeps them under his complete control. Malekith is the undisputed leader of the Dark Elves. Second only to him is his mother, Morathi, who acts as his regent when needed. Below them are the rulers of the cities, the Drakau, aided by the Volkar, commanders of the city armies. A fringe benefit of these positions is that their lives belong to Malekith. Only he may order their execution, and he will punish those who kill his lieutenants. Completely ruthless and utterly merciless are the most appropriate words to describe Dark Elf society. Its economy is based mainly upon slave labor. Dark Elves raid all other lands, particularly Ulthuan, home of their enemies, the High Elves. They take food and treasure, but the main purpose of the raids is to obtain slaves. Slaves play an important part in Druchii society, or Dark Elves. They're also known as Druchii, I forgot to mention that, as they perform the menial chores that that an enterprising Dark Elf deigns to be below him. Slaves also make up the bulk of the ritual sacrifices to the god Cain. Dark Elves do not value their slaves' lives and often kill one or two to show the other slaves their brutality. Slave revolts are rare, harshly suppressed, and due to the brutality of the Dark Elves, usually only the new stock have the will to participate in any revolt. The only successful revolts usually occur at sea, aboard either the slave ships or the Black Arks. In the former case, the surviving slaves tend to sail the captured ship to their freedom. In the latter case, the slave revolt is usually focused on stealing ships and escaping rather than taking over the Black Ark. The Dark Elves take to the sea in their Black Arks. Kept afloat by magic, the Black Arks travel far and wide to procure slaves. Each Black Ark is home to a small army of Dark Elf raiders and a small fleet of raiding vessels. These forces can be landed on the coast of an unsuspecting kingdom, perform a lightning raid, and be off before any of the local defense forces are able to react. In this way, countless millions of doomed souls have been taken back to Nagaroth to a fate worse than death. So we move on to religion next. The elven gods are separated into two groups. The first are the Kadai, who rule the heavens. The Kadai tend to represent productive and fundamental aspects of elven society, such as crafting, smithing, motherhood, farming, and hunting. The Kadai are openly worshipped and revered by the High Elves and by the Wood Elves, while seemingly being ignored by the Dark Elves. The second group are the Sithari, who rule Marie, the elven underworld. The High Elves and Wood Elves attempt to appease some of the Sithari, while shunning others. In Ulthuan, small shrines exist and some individuals worship Sithari privately. Depending on the deity in question, this ranges from frowned upon to totally outlawed. However, no formal priesthoods openly worship the underworld gods in Ulthuan or Athel Loren. On the other hand, the Dark Elves openly and proudly worship the Sithari, primarily Cain, the bloody-handed god. Each city has temples and shrines devoted to Cain, where blood sacrifices are made. Dark Elves are required to donate a percent of the slaves they capture on raids to the temple, but most Dark Elves make several additional sacrifices a year. The most savage sect of Cain worshippers are known as the Brides of Cain, more commonly called Witch Elves. They are an all-female cult of warrior priestesses. Witch Elves consider the battlefield to be a holy place and are suicidally fanatical in proving their worth to Cain by spilling the blood of their enemies. The cult is led by a high priestess called a hag, who bathe in blood to retain eternal youth. The holiest time of the year for Dark Elves is Death Night. During this night, the Witch Elves rule the streets of the Dark Elf cities, capturing anyone they find, whether they are slaves or Dark Elves, and either dragging them back to the temples or simply killing them on the spot as sacrifices to Cain. The Witch Elves will even go so far as to break into houses, which has led to Dark Elf families barricading windows and doors during this night. They also go as far as to steal children, training the girls to join their ranks, and tossing the boys into a cauldron of boiling blood. Although some survive this and are trained to become the assassins of Cain, a force to be truly feared. Besides the worship of Cain, a sizable portion of the population is also secretly kept alive worship of the chaos god of pleasure, Slaanesh. The cult of pleasure, led by Morathi, played a major role in the sundering of the elves of Ulthuan, but was considered heretical after the founding of Nagaroth and was brutally suppressed as the worship of Cain became prevalent. Morathi has since acquired a huge following of Slaanesh followers, both elven and human, and has invaded Lustria, but after being driven back north has started tensions with Crone Helbron, the leader of the cult of Cain, who is gathering followers to confront Morathi, which would lead to a devastating civil war. So that's a quick background and just lore kind of talk about the Dark Elves. You can see that there's a lot of tensions between them with religion, which of course in Total Warhammer that's going to be a big problem. You're going to have to be trying to suppress the worship of Slaanesh. Now of course we may not see the Dark Elves until the third game. They might be one of the last things added. Who knows? It'll probably be years before we see the Dark Elves, but we're still talking about them as if they're going to be added in like right away. So yeah, you're going to be dealing with some public order problems due to religion. That's definitely for sure. But yeah, so now we're going to move on to the roster. Now, the Dark Elves roster is quite large. They have a lot of units, which is quite nice. And now this is where it gets kind of simple for me. The Dark Elves, thankfully, only have a few legendary characters. A few of them are heroes, but I haven't seen anybody that's a hero been added to Legendary Lords, so I have 4 here. And you can see the roster while I've been talking about this. We have Malekith, Morathi, Helbron, and Malus Darkblade. So we'll be talking about them later, but you can see next to them, some of them have extra names next to them. So Seraphon is Malekith's personal black dragon, and Spite is Malus's personal cold one. But again, we'll talk about them later, but they're pretty cool. But first of all, we're going to talk about the generic lords. So first of all, we have the Dreadlord, and this is going to be your just basic melee lord. This is going to be your leader of armies, and he's going to be an absolute beast in combat. But of course, he suffers from all the other elven units. They're not very tough, but they're very fast, and they're very good at killing stuff. So they're not going to be heavily armored, they're not going to be really tough, but you'll be sure that they'll be able to take down dozens upon dozens of men by themselves. It's going to be pretty cool. The first caster we have are the Supreme Sorceresses. Now, these are extremely powerful wizards that have access to a lot of different lores. They have access to all 8 lores and their own lore, the lore of dark magic, which is unique to the Dark Elves, of course. And they are very powerful, of course. They can go toe-to-toe with pretty much all of the enemy or the other factions' top lords, of course the Lizardmen and the High Elves having probably the strongest magic in the game. They don't compare quite to them, but everybody else, they're quite strong comparatively. Next we have the High Beastmaster, and now this is someone who I'm not quite sure if will be in the game, but they're in the lord slot, so I thought I might as well mention them. And these are the guys that command the monsters of the Dark Elves. And again, I don't really know like what they could do, but why I mentioned them was they have access to being, in the tabletop that is, they have access to being on a Manticore, which is a huge beast, or a Scourge Runner for free. So I figured that the Beastmaster is obviously he's going to be quite powerful if he just comes base on a Manticore. That would be quite interesting. So that's why I mentioned him. But of course they do make your beasts better, so maybe he might be turned into more of a hero, where maybe if you have an army with lots of beasts, you put him in there to make them better. I'm not quite sure. Next we have the Black Ark Fleet Master. So just think of like a very powerful pirate from real life history, and that's basically what the Fleet Master is. He is the owner, per se, of a Black Ark, which is of course what we mentioned earlier. It's basically a floating city where the Dark Elves launch their raids from. So he's going to be a very powerful person, and of course if you can have armies of Black Ark Corsairs and other Black Ark units, it would be quite interesting if you could lead them with the Fleet Master. So basically he's just a lord, he's just a fluffy lord for that kind of army. So now we move on to heroes. We have the Master, which is just a step down from the Dreadlord. This is of course going to be kind of like the guy that gives your army more morale, trains your troops on the field, maybe I don't know what kind of abilities they could have in Total War, but of course on the battlefield they are going to be morale boosters. They're going to be extra combat heroes that do lots of damage and such. We have Sorceresses, which are just a step down from a Supreme Sorceress. They're going to be extra magic, no doubt doing buffs to your armies and such if you keep them in there and all that good stuff. And yeah, stuff like that. It's just going to be interesting. It's hard to talk about them because just like the other armies that are future factions, I have no idea what they can do on the battlefield. The 5 factions that are confirmed for Total War Warhammer now, we have information on what some of their agents do, so I could base it off that, but that's as far as I can really go. We have Death Hags, which are another wizard, which are of course part of the Cult of Cain, and they can actually be mounted on a Cauldron of Blood, which is a chariot that makes your which gives units around it a better save, or yeah, a magical save that, you know, might be in Total Warhammer. I'm not quite sure. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. The Death Hag can be mounted on that, and of course, it just makes magic better and such. Next, we have the Assassin, which of course is just going to be like your spy in regular Total War, probably poisoning people, assassinating people, and on the battlefield they're going to be really good at picking off characters and such, probably, and, you know, really dealing damage on enemy lords and such. And it's going to be quite cool, and you can see them, of course. So now we move on to the good part, the actual army. So first off, we have Dread Spears. Now, Dread Spears are the one of 3 regular Dark Elf infantry. These are, of course, as their name suggests, the spear infantry. So these are going to be your regular hold-the-line infantry, and you can see from their pictures they look really cool. Of course, they're armed with spears, so they're going to be good against enemy cavalry. They're just going to be a solid holding unit. There's not much more to really say about them other than that. We have Bleak Swords next, which are your base sword infantry. So you can see the Dark Elves are very easy to categorize with what their units are, just because of what their names are. So the Bleak Swords are going to be your first, like, kind of support and flank unit. So you can hold people with your Dread Spears and flank with the Bleak Swords, or just rush the Bleak Swords in and flank with someone else. It's going to be quite interesting. You can see it's the same unit with different weapons, essentially. Next, we have Black Ark Corsairs, which kind of ditch the armor and the shield in favor of having two-hand weapons and repeater crossbows. So that's going to be quite interesting. Hand bow, rather. So they can have two-hand weapons or a hand bow. So this gives them a little bit of extra oomph, basically. So before they charge in and kill some people, they can fire their hand bows in, which is literally like a one-hand handheld crossbow, which is quite interesting. And they're going to be devastating as they charge in. They're just spinning around with their two-hand weapons, just killing everybody. It's going to be pretty cool. We then have witch elves, which are going to be your next up flanking unit. These chicks are basically naked, as you can see from the pictures, but they're just going to be absolutely crazy. You can imagine them flipping around, going around your ranks and just cutting into the enemy infantry, just sacrificing them for Cain, and of course sacrificing themselves if they die. These are just going to be absolute damage dealers, but of course if they get shot at, they're going to die. If they stay in a prolonged fight that they can't win, they're going to die. Stuff like that. So it's going to be quite cool. We then have executioners, which are the first of two elite infantry. So the executioners are this heavily armored infantry that have huge glaives, and you can imagine just seeing one of those. You can imagine that just chopping down through someone, probably cutting them into pieces. It's going to be very interesting. And these, yeah, like I said, these are the first real elite infantry. So these are probably going to be later on in the game, and you can imagine that these charging into the back of someone would absolutely destroy them. So it's going to be quite nice to see them. Next we have the Black Guard, which are the second elite infantry, and these guys have halberds. So both of these infantry are going to be very weak to missile fire, of course, especially armor-piercing missiles. They're going to go right through the armor. But these guys are absolute beasts. They're even more heavily armored than the executioners, and those halberds are just going to be very useful. Where the glaives of the executioners would probably not be very armor piercing, although they are huge, the halberds can just rip apart people, of course, with just how the weapon works. They have blades and sharp points for stabbing and such. It's going to be really cool, and as you can see, they look absolutely amazing. It's one of my favorite Dark Elf units. Then to top it all off, we have the Sisters of Slaughter, which are just a more crazy unit of witch elves. Basically, they have masks on. They have more chain-based weapons, so they're going to be spinning around and just ripping people apart with those. It's going to be very cool. Again, just the same as the witch elves, it's going to be a very flank-oriented unit. So you're just going to be charging them into the back, and they're just going to rip everybody apart from the rear. It's going to be quite cool. Now we move on to ranged infantry. The first we have are the Dark Shards. Now these are repeater crossbow Dark Elf warriors. Now they, as you can see from the picture again, they look exactly the same as the Dark Elf infantry. It's just they have crossbows. Now these are going to be devastating. As you can imagine how devastating crossbows are in Attila. So imagine repeater crossbows. You think of the Chinese, what's the Chinese repeater crossbow? I don't know what it's called, but that same system where they pull the lever back and it just shoots every time. That's how this works too, I believe, or maybe it's just fully automatic because Warhammer, who knows. But they're going to be very interesting to see, and they're going to be absolutely devastating. I can't even imagine how bad it's going to be for enemy armies facing up against Dark Elves. Then to finish off ranged infantry, we have Shades. Now Shades are kind of like assassins, where they're actually going to have multiple options. So basically, they all have crossbows and a hand weapon, but they can take a crossbow, two-hand weapons, and a crossbow and a great weapon. So there's going to be like probably 2 units, we'll say. And these are going to be units that can deploy anywhere on the battlefield, and they are going to be just damage-dealing, assassinating, like badasses, basically, where they're just going to deploy and be hidden for most of the battle, and when they're really needed, they could pick off enemy important elite units, or maybe even heroes. Who knows how much damage they'll be able to do. And when they're needed, of course, they can use their two-hand weapons or even great weapons to just charge in and devastate enemies. Next, we move on to cavalry. So first we have the Dark Riders. Now these are almost like Dark Elf assassins mounted. You can see from the picture that they're very shrouded looking. They have cloth put over their heads so that they, of course, can't be really noticed, even though they're on horses. I don't know. And they have two-hand weapons, so they're going to be running through, just chopping through people. So you can see they're a very light cavalry, so they're going to be very fast, but very, very weak to even just anything, being shot at, being fought. So they're going to be more of a, not a shock cav, but more of a chasing down enemy ranged units, just chopping them to bits. And of course, in a rear charge, they would be quite useful as well. Next, we have Cold One Knights. Yeah, that's right. Lizard Men aren't the only ones that have Cold Ones. These are Cold Ones taken from Lustria. and they have just been turned into these absolutely evil beasts that the Dark Elves have rode on, or started riding on. These are, as you can see, they are Dark Elf warriors on the Cold Ones. It's not the same as these other ones where it's these light assassin type folks on horses. It is pure Dark Elf warriors on the back of these things, so they're going to be absolutely devastating. And of course, Cold Ones ripping through enemy units with their claws and their teeth. It's going to be really cool. We have Cold One chariots. So basically, just imagine a chariot with Cold Ones. They're going to be drawn by Cold Ones, and the people on the back are, of course, going to be stabbing at people and all that good stuff. It's, you know, there's not much to talk about them that you couldn't just imagine from looking at it. Yeah, it's drawn by Cold Ones. Not much more to say. We then have Scourge Runner chariots, which are just normal Dark Elf chariots. They're drawn by these really evil-looking horses, of course, because they're Dark Elves. Everything's evil. Ooh. But again, same story as the Cold Ones. It just wouldn't be as devastating as the Cold One chariot, because of course the Cold One chariot would have Cold Ones. They'd be ripping through people and stabbing them with their claws and biting them and stuff, whereas the Scourge Runner would just run through stuff like a normal chariot would. And then finally we have Doomfire Warlocks. Now Doomfire Warlocks, so these guys are pretty interesting because it's mounted sorcerers that have had their souls ripped from their bodies, and they're stuck in between the real world and the realm of chaos. And it's quite interesting because their souls are being consumed by Slaanesh, and the more it happens, the more their bodies start to burn with energy. Flaming runes take shape on their bodies, and it's quite interesting. So these are going to be like a slight magic unit, basically, because their souls are missing from their bodies. They're controlled basically by Slaanesh, so it's going to be quite weird to see them. But I'm quite excited at the same time because I don't know, it's going to be very interesting. Because they're going to be very devastating on the charge. Of course, they're magical, so they don't really care. People are going to be chopping at them. They're just going to be like, eh, whatever. I can take it. Keep chopping at me. I don't care. So it's going to be really cool to see them. We then have monsters. So for monsters, we have a couple of things. We have harpies. These are going to be your first thing. These are kind of just... They're not really monsters, but I couldn't really fit them in anywhere else. They're just what look like witch elves with wings, basically. So they're going to be your flanking around, taking out enemy ranged units kind of unit. They're not going to be like the most important unit in your army, that's for sure. And if you can take up a slot with the other monsters, it would probably be a good idea. But of course, these are going to have their usefulness, chasing down enemy units and killing skirmishers and such. Next, we have the War Hydra. Now, this is a multi-headed, just absolutely beast, which you can imagine in the tabletop. It's one of the most like powerful creatures in the game, and it's a beast that can regen. How regeneration works is at the end of every turn in the tabletop, you can roll to get back wounds, which is your health basically. Of course, unless the wound was caused by flaming attacks, then it just burns the flesh and it can't reform. So maybe they'll do something similar in Total War Warhammer with these creatures that have regeneration. So maybe, unless they're being attacked by flaming attacks, their health can go back up. So that would be pretty interesting. It would make them very useful. But with all the heads, it's just an absolute killing machine. It rips through people. It's ripping people apart with like all of its heads. It's going to be crazy. So people shooting at it, its health is just going to come back. It's no way to stop it, really. It's going to be pretty cool. And then we have the Caribis, which is another Hydra-type creature. It's a deep-sea monster, and it does basically much of the same things, only its attacks are poisoned, which is pretty cool. And on the tabletop, it's more of a monster killer than the Hydra is. The Hydra is really good at killing infantry, whereas this thing with its poison attacks are really good at killing monsters, and it's really good for flanking as well. So, while your soldiers are holding down the enemy, this Caribis can just charge in and just rip them apart, and it just scares everybody away because of how scary it is and how weird it is. If you can see the picture, you can definitely know it's pretty creepy. And yeah, it also has rules on the tabletop for being around water and stuff. So in Total War, maybe if you have a river battle or something, or near the water, it makes it tougher or something. Who knows? It would be pretty interesting. And then we have the Bloodrack Medusa, which is Medusa, essentially. Only instead of turning people to stone, it makes you bleed from everywhere, essentially, when you see it. So it's going to be very interesting. And there's actually a unit later that has the Medusa on it, so that's going to be interesting. But the Medusa basically is just going to be really good at killing things. It's going to be interesting. So if anybody looks at it, I don't know how they would put that into the game. So if people look at it, of course they're going to like die essentially because they're going to bleed from everywhere. So I'm not quite sure if they'll implement it or how they would implement it, but of course it would be nice to see, as it is a pretty impressive looking beast, and it is something that Dark Elf players kind of use sometimes. So who knows? So then we have artillery. So we have the Reaper Bolt Thrower. Now the Reaper Bolt Thrower is a big repeating bolt thrower. So imagine the repeater crossbows. Now make it really big, and you have the Reaper Bolt Thrower. So this is going to be throwing out multiple shots, or not multiple shots, but shots in very rapid succession. So it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be super devastating. If you can imagine ballistas and stuff from older games, this thing's going to be like choo choo choo, as opposed to just shooting and then like I don't know, 10 seconds later shooting again. It's going to be crazy. Against monsters and flying things, it'd probably be very good if they could actually hit flying things. And of course against ranked up infantry, it's just going to rip through them and kill dozens of men each. It's going to be very cool. And then finishing off the roster, we have war machines. So like I mentioned earlier, we have the Cauldron of Blood. Now the Cauldron of Blood is just something that Death Hags and Crone Hellbrun can get on, and it just boosts up their magic, makes units around them a bit more tough and do more damage and such. So it's going to be very interesting. You can see it looks pretty cool. And then we have the Blood Rack Shrine, which is a chariot type thing that carries around the Medusa, and it puts out a lot of attacks from it because it has Shrine Keepers on it, which are more Death Hags essentially, and it also has, of course, the Medusa on it, so that thing's just going to be killing people all the time and making people explode into blood and such essentially. So it's going to be interesting. Again, I'm not quite sure if they'll implement it because, well, it's another Medusa unit. I'm not quite sure how they'd work that in, but it would be nice if they did. So to finish off this roster bit, we have the legendaries. So first off, we have Malekith, the Witch King. So Malekith was born between Anarion, the first High Elf Phoenix King, and Morathi. So after his father died, Malekith succeeded his father as Prince of the Northern Province of Nagaroth, and considered himself to be the obvious choice of the Phoenix King. So he was so confident in himself that he let the High Elf Council vote, and a lot of them were against him because he was he wasn't suited for the role. He was quite warlike, and he had a very short temper, and he liked settling things with violence. So guess what he did? He tried to settle it with violence. So he started a very terrible civil war essentially to become Phoenix King, which pretty much ended with him killing most of the princes and most of the council. And he attempted to march into the sacred flame of Assyrian, which is a trial that marks the Phoenix King as the chosen of the elven creator god. But it didn't really work out for him, and he was burned alive completely. Like 100% of his body was burned. So he was taken away by his supporters and his mother. And after his body was healed, just due to pure determination to live, he was created a suit of black armor by Hotek, which was a renegade priest of Vaul, the elven smith god, who created an amazing suit of armor, like I said, which was actually fused to his skin because the suit was white hot from the furnace. So his skin is literally his armor. He doesn't take that off, but it's magical armor. So he's almost invincible now. He's crazy strong because of this magical armor and the fact that he's just really powerful. And due to his mother being Morathi, he's been taught lots of magic. So he's actually in the tabletop. There's level 1, 2, 3, and 4 wizards. Level 4 being the toughest or the highest level, basically. And Malekith is a level 4 wizard due to his mother Morathi teaching him everything she knows about dark magic. So he knows the lore of dark magic. So he's going to be a melee and caster lord. So Malekith is going to be crazy on the field. And as I mentioned earlier, he has his own unique mount, which is Seraphon, his black dragon. So there he is. Of course, every faction leader has to have their crazy mount. There's Carl Franz with Deathclaw. There's Thorgrim with the Throne of Power. Azheg with Skullmuncher, all that stuff. So he's up there with his cool mounts, being a black dragon. So that's going to be very cool, of course. Next, we have Morathi, which is Malekith's mother. She is not only the only witch elf ever allowed to use magic, but she is also the most powerful user of the dark arts, and one of the most powerful magic users in the world of Warhammer. So it's going to be very interesting to see her. She's going to be casting absolutely devastating magic, and she's actually struck pacts with demons. So her dark magic is kind of elevated by that. It's going to be quite cool. She's just going to be absolutely devastating on the field. And of course, the fact that she has a strong Slaanesh following, that might tie into the game, who knows. But all I know is that her obsession with Slaanesh is causing a lot of problems with the Cult of Cain, so I'm not quite sure if you'll also have to deal with stuff like that. But it'll be quite interesting. So then next we have Crone Helbron, which is the High Priestess of Cain and the Blood Queen of Har Ganeth. She is the leader of the Cult of Cain, and she is the second oldest Hag Queen after Morathi, who is her nemesis and religious rival. Unlike Morathi, who has access to the first and true Cauldron of Blood, Helbron is not completely rejuvenated by the powers of her own cauldron, thus allowing her to live a long life but at a steeper cost. So she has to sacrifice a lot of people. That's a thing about the Cult of Cain. All who worship Cain and do all the blood sacrifices and stuff bathe in the blood of their sacrifices, and it rejuvenates them, keeps them young forever. But Crone Helbron is not cursed, but in a kind of a way that she has to sacrifice much more to stay young looking. So months go by where she has to endure being an old, ugly woman, but only a few weeks out of that time is she actually able to be beautiful and stay young looking. So she is, in a way, it is kind of a curse. So it's quite interesting. But despite her appearance, Helbron remains immensely powerful. She alone is the greatest of the Hag Queens. Her mastery of the many ways of murder is without equal. As Blood Queen of Har Ganeth, she may call upon legions of witch elves, executioners, assassins, and other Cainites to do her bidding. The Master Assassin Shadowblade, which I haven't mentioned because he's a hero and not a lord, is loyal to her. So you can see that she might be a problem. If there's ever a chance in Total War Warhammer where the characters of the Dark Elves actually do have a civil war, she would be very hard to deal with, as she owns the Cult of Cain, essentially. So anybody loyal to the Cult of Cain, which is a lot of stuff, would be under her control. So it's going to be very interesting. I do kind of hope they actually add in that mechanic of civil wars between the different religions. It would be awesome to see. But again, if it's not, it's something I could live without, basically. So then finally we have Malus Darkblade. Now Malus Darkblade is a very, very interesting character. He is the ruler of Haggref, which is one of the 6 very important cities, and basically he was denied his right of being a noble due to him being a bastard of the relationship between... He was born from Lurhan the Valkyr and Eldri, which was a sorceress. Now, Lurhan was not meant to keep the sorceress, as Malekith ordered him to give her up and give her to Malekith, but he very much did not do that, and they had a child, which was Malus. Now Malus, of course, expected to become the heir of Lurhan, but he was denied all that. But in his attempts to, he ends up meeting a demon by the name of Zarkhan, which is entrapped in a temple in the Chaos Wastes, where he went to try to empower himself, essentially. Now Zarkhan takes Malus's soul and tells him that he must find 5 artifacts within a year to free the demon from his prison. Now, he actually does it, and just to make a quick mention, he could draw power from the demon, but it increased his influence on him. So he was possessed by the demon, his soul was replaced by the demon. But despite all the odds, he did succeed in returning to the temple with the artifacts, and he enacted the right to free him, but he anticipated being tricked, so he fought the demon, but during the fight his soul was stolen by the demon. So instead of just taking his soul, it's now stolen. The demon just takes it, which turned Malus into a soulless killer, With the Warp Sword of Cain, the only surviving artifact from the right, Malice wandered the Chaos Wastes unkillable until he discovered the location of the demon and reclaimed his soul. In the process, however, the demon was sealed again, but in Malice's body. Now Malice rules the city of Haggrafe and is the personal champion of Malekith. So he's going to be absolutely crazy. He's possessed by a demon, guys, and he has access to the Sword of Cain, which is just going to be absolutely just crazy. He's going to be an awesome general, and no doubt he's going to have lots of abilities unique to him, and he's just going to be able to kill dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of people, who knows. But yeah, it's going to be quite interesting. And of course, he has access to his own unique mount, which is Spite, the cold one. So he's going to be just a more ferocious, probably bigger cold one than a normal one. So yeah, guys, this has been the Dark Elves faction focus video. I know it was maybe I went off topic a couple of times. Maybe I missed some things, but again, please be sure to check down in the comments below. I'm sure someone will correct any mistakes I may have made, or just fix up any things that may have went wrong. But yeah, guys, this has been Overkill as always, and I'll see you in the next faction focus. Until then, goodbye.